All right, so we left off talking about how the property taxes paid in any given neighborhood were a good indicator of the quality of education in that neighborhood because the higher the property taxes were, the more funding that schools in that particular neighborhood or independent school district would receive. Well, this obviously created a lot of inequality because the rich neighborhoods had really high quality schools, poor neighborhoods had really low quality schools. But Texas actually came up with kind of a unique solution to this problem. So I believe it was in the 90s. Texas passed this legislature that was called Recapture, or more casually referred to as the Robin Hood program. And as the name would suggest, this Robin Hood program was kind of entitled to take some of the money being produced from the property taxes in really rich neighborhoods and rich school districts and redistributing it to some of the poorer school districts, right? So Texas requires the state to take funding from school districts with higher property values and give it to poor school districts that can't raise much money, right? So this is kind of seems like a sociologically informed solution here, right? To get rid of this inequality, instead of just expecting poor schools to try and catch up to the top, why not level out the playing field by decreasing some of the funding that these really rich schools were receiving, right? So, there's a quote from an article. I actually assigned it to you this week to read about Texas Recapture so you can kind of understand the history and what's going on with it. But within that article, I thought this was a really great quote. It said, superintendents in wealthier school districts often argue they're giving away money that they desperately need in order to hire experienced teachers and keep art and music programs running. But Robin Hood is designed to help the poorer districts that receive that money. And those districts would have an even harder time hiring teachers and running extracurricular programs without it. So this is obviously a very controversial piece of legislature, mainly because people in power don't want to give up their power, right? That's the basis of conflict theory. And that's what we're seeing here. These rich school districts are saying, we don't like this. Obviously, this money is coming from our taxpayers and our school districts. We don't want to have to give that up. You know, we're having a hard time hiring high quality teachers and maintaining our arts programs because we have to give this money away. But on the flip side, these schools in these super poor districts are having an even harder time simply hiring teachers, period, regardless of the quality of them, having a hard time buying textbooks, providing basic essentials to maintain their schools. So, of course, you're always going to get that push and shove, that resistance. Whenever you present any sort of policy or legislature that is going to take away from a higher class individual, you're always going to experience that pushback and that resistance because nobody likes to feel like they're having things taken away from them. But from a conflict theorist perspective, if we ever want to achieve greater social equality, we need to have some sort of balance of give and take to level out the playing field. If we ever want to get a place where that maintaining a level playing field is something that would be sustainable. So here are a few charts to just kind of help you visualize, if you're a visual person like myself, how this recapture process works. So this shows data from a number of years throughout the past 5 years or so of the local tax revenue paid for in Austin, Texas Independent School District. All right. So you can see that in 2014, the Austin Independent School District ended up paying about $700 million in local taxes, right? And of that $700 million, Austin Independent School District got to keep about $600 million of that. And they ended up, looks like, reallocating about maybe $100 million of that recaptured funding. And that recaptured funding went to poorer school districts throughout the state of Texas. So you can see that over the past 5 years or so, they've allowed Austin to keep about $600 million of funding. I'm not too familiarized with the ins and outs of this particular legislature and the formulas that are used to calculate what each independent school district gets to keep and how much they need to actually contribute to the recapture funds. But at any rate, $600 million seems like it should be a relatively sufficient amount to sustain the funding for a school district. And this excess amount of tax revenue is going to school districts that make substantially less. One quote from this particular article that I asked you to read says that property-wealthy school districts can tax their homes and businesses and raise all the money the state has determined they need. And if they end up raising more than that amount, the state collects or recaptures the additional money through a program also known as Robin Hood. And again, that money gets redistributed to very poor or in-need school districts throughout the state of Texas. So one particular school district that is at the very much the lower end of socioeconomic status is the Bowles Independent School District of Texas. So you can see here that in every year since 2014, Bowles Independent School Districts has made very little money in terms of property tax revenue. Looks like maybe somewhere around $100,000 a year in comparison to Austin, Texas's, $7 million in 2014, almost double that by 2018. So you can see the amount of local funding that they raise from their own property tax values and the amount of funding that they end up getting from the Recapture program, right? Look at this. Because of Recapture, independent school districts in Bowles and in other counties and other school districts throughout the state of Texas are able to have significantly more funding for their educational systems, right? And it's not that they're receiving more funding than anywhere else. They're receiving less than Austin, actually. But it's just trying to, again, level out the playing field. It's not about trying to give advantages, unearned advantages to these oppressed communities of lower socioeconomic status. It's just trying to give them equal opportunities. And that's really what a lot of the fight over social equality is about. It's not trying to say that feminism is about trying to let women take over the world so men can be disadvantaged. Saying Black Lives Matter isn't saying that white lives don't matter. It's really just about achieving equality. That's really what it is. And in order to do that, we need to create some sort of policies that give advantages to oppressed groups that have faced marginalization and oppression for centuries. If we ever want to get to a place in time where this level of human equality can actually sufficiently run itself. All right, so let's talk a little bit about cultural capital. This is another aspect that conflict theorists are really interested in here. So when we're talking about cultural capital, we're referring to the cultural knowledge and experience that any individual may have that can be translated to forms of economic and social capital. So cultural capital isn't necessarily talking about money, but people that have more money also tend to have more cultural capital. So what are some examples of this? Well, think, for example, about how you might have a very different lived experience as a student if you have two college-educated parents versus if you're a first-generation college student, right? So for one clear example of this is, how would you know how to fill out college applications or apply for FAFSA, right? Federal Student Aid, financial aid, if you don't have college-educated parents or a well-trained school counselor to help you, right? Have you ever thought about that? So if you have college-educated parents who are very familiar with how to apply to colleges, if they're familiar with how to fill out the FAFSA, you're at a cultural advantage. And that's what cultural capital is, right? Another example of cultural capital is having parents that are able or were willing to read to you as a child. By the age of 3, one study found that children of professionals have vocabularies that are 50% larger than those of children from working class families. And one of the main reasons is that if you come from a family where you have one or two parents that have a bachelor's degree or higher in college, you're more likely to be read to as a child. And a part of that is not because, poor parents of working class or poor families are lazy or don't want to read to their children, but many of them work jobs that are second or third shift. So they often are working at nighttime before or when children put to bed and are typically read to at home. And so there's a lot of really small and intricate layers that can go into the level of education and the quality of education that a student or an individual can receive that aren't even directly related to the quality of school that they go to. This cultural capital plays a really meaningful influence on how much knowledge we're able to attain and the access to opportunities that we have. Socioeconomic status, of course, is a very integral part of the problems in education that we see. If anyone from a lower socioeconomic status is automatically going to be disadvantaged in education, right? Imagine if you are in a household where you are either living in or near the poverty line as a young adult, right? As an adolescent, as a 14, 15, 16-year-old, your family may need you to go out and work an hourly job 5 nights a week and on weekends in order to sustain your household, right? For example, a 14-year-old living in a household that's living at or near poverty might be required to get a job working at a convenience store or a fast food restaurant after schools and on weekends just to have that hourly wage to help pay for food and everyday maintenance of life for their family household, right? So if you have to work full or part-time as a high school student, you obviously are going to have less time to complete your homework, which means you're probably going to have worse grades in school. You're definitely not going to have time to participate in extracurricular activities, which negatively impacts the likelihood that you'll be able to get into college. You're probably going to have less time to take any sort of SAT or ACT prep courses, so your testing scores are probably going to be lower. And all of these factors contribute to a lower likelihood of people from lower socioeconomic status being able to go off into college in the first place, right? So again, very important to understand how these different intersections of our identity affect our abilities to succeed in terms of the realm of education. Tracking is another social problem in the institution of education. This process refers to instances where students are put into different educational programs, or tracks as they may be called, based on either real or perceived abilities. So we just talked about how socioeconomic status might result in students being from poor working class families having worse test scores or performing worse in school, which would likely put them in a lower track. For example, just like versus a honors track or a college prep track, just the general track, just the track students get in, don't take any advanced classes, just take the bare minimum classes that you need to get your high school education so you can be done with education altogether. But what we also know is that teachers often place students into track based off of not even their actual abilities, but what they perceive them to be. Unfortunately, we live in a society that is built off of institutions like racism and sexism and classism, which means that teachers often have lower expectations for their students that are people of color. Teachers have lower expectations for students that are women, and teachers have lower expectations for students that come from poor or working class families. So as a result, the biases and the prejudices that teachers have can actually have very material consequences on the ability, the educational outcomes of their students, regardless of the student's actual abilities, right? So while tracking may have its advantages, for example, by ensuring that bright students meet their fullest potential while not overwhelming students who are struggling, conflict theorists definitely argue that tracking reproduces inequality. And this is because students put into the lowest or least academically rigorous track typically enter the workforce immediately after high school because they have been socialized to think that they're not really good at school, they shouldn't expect to go on to college because getting a high school degree is really the most that they're capable of. On the flip side of that, students that get put into higher tracks, right, college prep tracks or even honors tracks, often attend prestigious colleges, and students that get put on tracks in between are typically those that just go on to either local or regional universities. So you can see that the track that you get put into as a student can really have a profound and material consequence on the quality and level of education that you receive. And again, it doesn't even need to be based on your actual ability. We don't live in this perfect world where teachers are these exemplar human beings that see the world without any privilege or without any bias or prejudice. No, teachers are human too. We all have bias, we all have prejudice, and this is something we'll talk more about next week. But the downfall of that is that oftentimes teachers will put students of color, students of lower socioeconomic status, and women into lower tracks than they would put men who are white and who are of higher social class, because we as a society devalue those marginalized groups and think that they're less capable of achieving our educational success.